All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you all for joining the Western Center for Social Impact and Innovation for our second Western College Legacy Seminar speaker this spring, Dr. Craig Calhoun. I am Jackie Doherty, and I direct the Western Center, which is Miami University's interdisciplinary hub for social justice and impact issues. Dr. Calhoun joins us during the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer and on Super Tuesday of the 2024 election cycle. So we think that a talk on degenerations and renewals of global democracy is fairly timely. Note that we do have some tables out front here worth visiting. The Wilkes Leadership Institute can register you to vote, as can the local League of Women Voters, and they can also have you sign a petition against gerrymandering in Ohio. I want to start off briefly by reading the Miami's land acknowledgement. Miami University carries the name of the Miami people who, along with the Shawnee, were forcibly removed from these homelands. Despite centuries of colonization, the Miami people preserve a deep connection to this land and are engaged in a vibrant resurgence of their heritage, language, and culture. The university maintains a strong reciprocal relationship with the Miami tribe of Oklahoma, grounded in our shared commitment to learning and each other. To learn more, visit the Miami Center's website. Before I provide a brief welcome, I'd also like to thank the Western College Alumni Association for its generous support for tonight's program and the commitment it shares to all things Western with the Western Alumni Association of Miami University. We're excited to continue our exploration of challenges to modern democracy with Professor Craig Calhoun. He is a world-renowned social scientist whose work connects sociology to culture, communication, politics, philosophy, and economics. Currently, the University Professor of Social Sciences at Arizona State University, he has previously served as Director of the London School of Economics, President of the Social Science Research Council, and University Professor of Social Sciences at New York University. Professor Calhoun will address the issues explored in his most recent book, Degenerations of Democracy, co-authored with Charles Taylor and Dilip Gankar. Challenging commonplace narratives, this work interrogates the underlying causes of democratic decline and examines the most promising strategies for revitalizing democracy around the globe. As many of you know, it will be 60 years this June since Bob Moses and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organized Freedom Summer at the Western College for Women, now part of Miami University. This action was a part of one of the longest running and most successful movements to fulfill the democratic promise of the U.S. project, the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Freedom Summer's goal was to build interdependent, interracial networks of solidarity in order to expand the legal rights of Black Americans through access to the ballot in the South. Hundreds of mostly white college students arrived on Western's campus in 1964 to be trained in the law, the history of Black U.S. human rights struggles, and nonviolent civil action in preparation for the danger they would face from white supremacist authorities as they embedded in Black communities in Mississippi. As we know, 3 organizers were murdered by local authorities because often fascist movements refuse to share power with the people they hope to exclude from democratic participation. This is true of both the fascism of the 20th century Jim Crow and its legacy in our current struggles against far-right movements who sought to overturn a legitimate presidential election just a few years ago. I see 2 important commonalities between Freedom Summer and the work of Dr. Calhoun and his colleagues. First, that Freedom Summer is an excellent model of the type of broad-based movement organizing that will strengthen our democracy. And second, Freedom Summer's use of building interracial networks of solidarity and intergroup dialogue are critical in the inner workings of democratic movement building. I would ask you to hold on to your questions, as we will have some time at the end for that. And without further ado, we welcome Dr. Craig Calhoun.
Well, let me begin with thanks for that gracious introduction, Jackie, and thank you for inviting me here and inviting me on the auspicious occasion of the anniversary of Freedom Summer and the somewhat less auspicious occasion of Super Tuesday 2024. And we might reflect on that. Freedom Summer was partly about the importance of voting and the importance of the freedom and the right to vote for all Americans, and you should vote. The way that Super Tuesday 2024 has played out is that a combination of media and political forces make your vote look irrelevant because so much looks already decided in the primaries. But it's your vote. You shouldn't let it be irrelevant, and especially in the actual election, you should exercise your right at the franchise, and you should refuse the idea that elections are predetermined by money and media and power structures in political parties. So fight for the elections. But one more thing, fighting isn't just the elections. The importance of Freedom Summer was in large part about its contribution to continued movement building in the United States. And this is as important a part of democracy as actually voting. It is vital that there be mechanisms to give citizens voice, to shape the agendas for the elections, to admonish leaders who are not performing, to advance issues, not only by putting them on the political agenda, but by direct action. So whether it's climate change or social justice or a more prosperous economy or conservation of local environment, these are all issues that are open to not only public policy, but direct action through those who organize in movements. So we owe a lot to our forebears in Freedom Summer and in movement organizing. So I'd like to start today by telling you that democracy is in great shape. Unfortunately, that would be a lie. And I don't want to lie to you. Democracy is not in great shape. And that democracy is not in great shape is one of the few things on which all Americans seem to agree, regardless of their political preferences. Only 4% of Americans today tell pollsters that they think our political system is working very well, let alone extremely well. Right? 23% say somewhat or higher. In other words, a clear majority, 3/4 think not working. 65% say they feel always or often exhausted when talking about politics. It's not a subject that gets them excited and energized, as I suspect it was for all those young people here who are preparing for Freedom Summer, right? And ready to talk about it late into the night, full of optimism and a sense that things could change. Tires us out. 55% of Americans, when polled, this is the Pew Survey Research Center, say they always or often feel angry about politics. And only 16% that they trust the federal government most of the time. I won't comment further on the word cloud, but the size of the bubble is how many times people mentioned this word when asked, how would you describe US politics, right? And these are the only words that got above 10%. Trust is not much in evidence. It has been declining. The top graph shows you the pattern for decline in trust in the federal government in the United States, and it's pretty striking. Right? At the point of Freedom Summer, right, nearly 80% of Americans expressed a high degree of trust in the US government. That isn't because they thought everything was right with America, just because they thought government could be part of making it better. This declined fairly precipitously through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, recovered just slightly in the Reagan years, declined again under Bush, recovered a little bit under Clinton, declined again under Bush, again, did not recover under Obama. did not recover under Trump and has not recovered under Biden. But to put that in context, the bottom graph is a chart of how much Americans trust major social institutions in general. It's a composite of the question asked, how much do you trust health institutions? How much do you trust the courts? How much do you trust business? How much do you trust the military? And so forth. Putting together the 8 major institutions that we're asked about, here is the pattern, again, of a decline, a significant decline to the lowest level of trust since the survey's been administered across these institutions. Some better, some worse, none of them rising. Asked whether they think politicians focus on making the country better or just on winning, 90% of Americans told a recent University of Virginia survey they think politicians are all about winning, not making the country better. Oh, and there's a typo in the next line. People think the other side, not wide, wins more, right? That is, according to the Pew survey and to the charts here, almost, well, a clear majority, about 3/4 of Americans, think their side is losing. The Democrats think their side is losing. The Republicans think their side is losing even more, that they both think their side is losing. This is not an optimistic position for politics. Americans also tend to think that the other side causes all the problems. Right? The other side is closed-minded, the other side is dishonest, the other side is immoral, the other side is unintelligent and lazy. Right? And a majority of Republicans say 4 or more of these traits are true of all the Democrats. Nearly as many Democrats say that of the Republicans. These are exemplary instances of what my colleagues Charles Taylor, Dilip Gaonkar, and I have called degenerations of American democracy. By degenerations, we mean internal declines in how well American democracy is working. We don't mean Xi Jinping doesn't like democracy. We don't mean Vladimir Putin doesn't like democracy. They don't. That's a different problem. How well American democracy is working from within is the question we're trying to take up. And we see these degenerations. And the citizens who are just surveyed see many of them. For example, hyperpartisanship, being so committed to your side winning that that's more important to you than the overall net result. We see this certainly in an absence of bipartisanship in Congress, but we see it in a variety of arenas, and we see it in politics pursued as a kind of sport. We just want to win. We see it also in a sort of winning at all cost mentality, in which the goal of winning is so important that it doesn't matter how you win or what you will be able to do afterwards, whether you will be able to collaborate in order to make policy, what it will do for the next election. Right? We see it in polarized opinion, and sharply polarized opinion. And when I first started working on this question a couple of decades ago, I could have said at this point, that's less true locally. And it's actually still less true. It's only slightly less true locally. One of the trends over the last 20-some years has been that national political polarization has colonized localities. It used to be that most communities could make decisions about schools or about healthcare or about where to put a new airport or where to build a road in ways that were not organized as perceived left-right, Democrat-Republican, national candidate struggles. That is much less true than it used to be. So even our local communities face an issue of the impact of national polarization. National candidates come and grandstand and make statements about local issues to get airplay and win support. Local politicians reach out to them, align their proposals with national platforms, and a variety of opinion-leading organizations work to develop standards of connection that we have with our fellow Americans of different backgrounds. Let me give one example in case I don't get to mentioning one of the possible lines of solution at the end, since my talk is too long and I'm just going to stop when I ran out of time. There was compulsory national service in the form of a draft in 1963 and when I was in college, a decade later, and got drafted. The compulsory national service was not universal, and that was a flaw. So it was easier for college students to get student deferments or otherwise to get out of the draft, and it ended up creating a class composition to the military. But it was still connective. In World War II, mass military service, right, connected a majority of American men in the right age group to each other beyond geographies. People from Brooklyn knew people from New Mexico. People from Michigan knew people from Louisiana because of common military service. Independent of the military objectives of this common military service, it was connecting. Right? Amid the unpopularity of the Vietnam War, people in my generation shouted ROTC off campus and the draft. And ROTC programs closed at many universities. The draft was ended. It was replaced with a new structure of a so-called all-volunteer army, which made the army partly a job option and largely a caste structure in which the single biggest predictor of military service is a parent or older sibling in the military. Right? In other words, a certain segment of the population, largely Black and brown and largely rural, has become central to the military. And most white people on college campuses don't know people in the military. Right? We've really separated it. Well, that's one example of fragmented solidarity. I would call for national service for everybody, not all of it military, right? To do a variety of different kinds of work, but to connect people in the country. But we need things to overcome fragmented solidarity. As I said, the degenerations we talk about are internal, downward spirals. They involve declines in institutional capacity, social political cohesion, and public discourse itself, our actually effective ability to talk to each other across lines of political difference. And it's caused partly by a sense of citizen disempowerment, partly by struggles that try to reverse previous gains, and partly by erosion of social support systems. And I'm going to say a little bit in this talk about each of those three, but mostly the third. And it's exacerbated by sheer speed of change. That is, a decline in the economy is always painful. A decline in the economy over 100 years is manageable as there are new opportunities and people relocate and younger people take up different occupations from their parents. A decline over a decade isn't in the same way. And good news, bad news. Degenerations of this kind have been recurrent throughout American democracy. That's mostly bad news. But it's good news in the sense that we have overcome them before, and we can overcome them again. These are not each of them fatal. We tend to say things like, this is unprecedented. I can't believe that something like this is happening. And often it's happened before, and repair work has been done. Let me speak first about one of the underlying long-term conditions for this: scale. When the United States was founded, it already was a surprisingly large country to attempt democracy by the standards of almost everybody's thinking. So people would hark back to ancient Greece, right? Where the number of people participating in democracy could be convened in the agora, and the number eligible could be in the range of 6,000, and the society as a whole in Athens, 60,000, right? There were 2.5 million Americans at the time of the Declaration of Independence, total Americans, men, women, children, right? And they worried that this was too large a country to attempt democracy. Founders like James Madison wrote at length on the problem that we're going to face because we're just too big. Well, we're 335 million now. And this creates a challenge for being able to organize ourselves, to have political debate, to feel that we really belong together, to know who each other are in various ways, right? States in the United States range from Wyoming with 584,000 residents to California with 39 million, right? That's a pretty big range of variation for the supposedly equal American states. And think about the local, since I at least am convinced we need dynamism and activism and self-government at a local level. We don't just need to have positions about Washington, and we certainly don't just need politicians who try to make careers getting to or rising in Washington. We need people to lead at local levels. What does the local mean? Small towns are prominent. The idea of the New England Town Hall meeting as a basic structure of democracy is ingrained in a lot of Americans thinking about history, and almost no one's thinking about the present. There are still town hall meetings, right? Just below the old town hall, there's a picture of a new town hall meeting debating something, but it's a pretty small town that can fit its people into a building like that for a town hall meeting, or even a room like the middle picture, right? Small town used to mean numbered in the tens or maybe low single digit hundreds. I grew up largely in a small town, not all that far from here. We used to think it was a small town. All of us when we were teenagers thought it was an incredibly small town and couldn't wait to get out. But it's about 30,000 people, right? People would describe Oxford, Ohio, as a small town, right? The language of the small town is pretty elastic, right? How small do we mean? What about counties? What about cities? How big do the cities get? What does it mean when cities have more citizens than the United States had as its founding for how we work together? Well, it means in part, of course, that they get broken into parts, into fractions. They have neighborhoods, they have, in like New York City, boroughs and local government authorities within the city. They get broken, though, too, on political mobilizing. So there are the Latinx and the Black and the different groups vying for power as organized subgroups in cities, and cities are huge. What about metropolitan regions? Because many kinds of questions about how we live together aren't actually organized by towns or counties or cities. They're organized in very large, complex regions. That includes cities and the people who commute to them from distant suburbs, and that organize industry similarly. Now, my point about all of this is we need to, and we have been inadequately, we need to reinvent institutions. To just keep saying, we should have town hall meetings, that would be great, is sort of an irrelevant policy. We can have assemblies, and there is a movement to have more people gather in rooms like this, more people gather for debate and discussion. but there are such limits on how many can gather face to face. We inevitably turn to the media, but we inevitably turn to something opaque. So think of the difference between democracy, debated among people who can look each other in the eye and speak to each other without microphones, and democracy filtered through the news media, very large scale elections, political parties, fundraising, and so forth. It's changed its character. And so it's not surprising that citizens feel disempowered in relation to the large institutions. We depend a lot on mediating institutions. And American democracy survived and prospered and thrived, often, not always, because America was very good at building mediating institutions. The great French analyst Alexis de Tocqueville made this a key point in his book, Democracy in America, which is probably the most popular book written by a foreigner that Americans have ever embraced, right? He said, Americans are great joiners. They join clubs and societies. They gather to discuss how their school should be organized. They are in both governmental, political, and social, and indeed religious settings, joiners who come together in clubs. Well, he was talking about the 1830s, right? Not as true anymore. It stayed very true of the United States. In comparative surveys compared to European and other countries, Americans were much more likely to join voluntary associations. They were more likely to actually go to church, a lot of things. Well, look at the picture here of 60 years of religion in America, including years in which Americans have been excited about the role of religion in politics. It has not been matched by attendance at church, right? Or synagogue, or other kinds of religious services. Or look at union membership, which peaked shortly after World War II, right? And has been in a long decline ever since, right? Now, that means one thing for negotiations between workers and employers, which is an issue in empowerment of people. But it means something further in terms of the role that unions once played as important mediating institutions. People belong to societies by belonging to mediating institutions, by belonging to churches, by belonging to alumni associations, by belonging to unions, by belonging to motorcycle clubs, right? By belonging to various kinds of groups that connect us to others, we are connected into the larger society. But in fact, our mediating institutions have almost all declined. Scouting used to be much more common, right? It's fallen by 60% over recent years. Fraternal associations have all but disappeared. The Benevolent Protective Order of the Elks. You might see the sign on a meeting house, but none of you is likely to join. The Rotary Club, the Lions Club used to be staples of American society. Veterans associations have declined, right, by close to 70%. There are still veterans, but the veterans associations are full of people my age or older. They are not, the veterans of foreign wars includes veterans of the Korean War, the few surviving World War II veterans, and some, but not most, Vietnam veterans because of the controversies around the war, and hardly any veterans of the Iraq War or other more recent wars. Right? Even neighborhood associations in cities have declined precipitously during these recent decades. Right? Now, there may be recovery. In fact, this is one of my #1 recommendations for making things better. But it isn't happening in large scale yet. Money and media are part of the show. We are connected to each other not by membership associations and not by groups that carry out projects, whether it's cleaning up the neighborhood or cleaning up a river or getting rid of toxic waste or any other kind of project. We are joined together largely by donations. So our relationship, even to movement organizations, is not that of the Freedom Summer volunteers who convened here and in a few other places on northern campuses and went to the south of the United States and campaigned, sometimes at risk of violence, for change, it is often to send a donation. Party politics has been changed by money in the same sort of way. Right? Look at the chart of billionaire contributions by party. The chart's compiled by somebody who wants to show that the Supreme Court Citizens United decision is a problem, and I think it is a problem. But I'm just pointing out how much increase there has been in the extent to donations by the very rich shape American politics. Spending the political cycle, right? It's estimated, the chart in blue, the blue bar graphs, are charts of just advertising spending. That's why it's money and media. Nothing but advertising spending, almost entirely television advertising spending, because social media budgets are treated differently, right? So more than $10 billion is going to be spent this election. The cost of being elected to any federal office is enormous. We have rich people in office, but we also have fundraising machines that are absolutely dominant in lots of this. And then we have the media itself, and then the social media world, increasingly prominent, the main source of news for many people, and particularly prone to division into separate channels for people with different opinion. We have a precipitous decline of local media, right? Newspapers, last year, newspapers closed in America at the rate of 2.5 per week, right? The number of counties that don't have any newspaper in them, right, rose, right, by the hundreds in America. Newsroom employment dropped by 60%. It's not totally bad news for journalism majors, but if you're a journalism major, I'm pretty sure you got taught something about how to promote yourself as an independent voice online and not count on having a full-time job, because this is increasingly the future of people working in the media. The decline of local media has been studied and shown to be linked to increased polarization and increased corruption in local politics. There are more corrupt contracts that eventually wind up in court cases showing that there's been bribery or other insider dealing over building roads or other kinds of activity in those places that don't have local media, right? And there's more extreme polarization along the same lines as the national polarization in the places that don't have local media, right? New media, platform-based media, only partly compensate. But platforms have increased. You can't just sort of say, I wish that away, when it go back to only print newspapers, right? But we need to look at the extent to which the platforms are organized in ways that don't produce content moderation, that do produce echo chambers, right? And that segment population. Also organized in ways that are highly shaped by algorithms to try to manipulate and manage attention, right? So that computer programs are in effect organizing what people pay attention to. Now, this is not totally transformative. People in the age of print newspapers paid attention to big headlines and often didn't read all the small stories on page 3. It's not that this is totally night and day different, right? But we are subject to large extents of algorithmic attention manipulation and the use of bots and the use of other devices to amplify messages, right, including manipulated by international actors. So not the whole problem, but not a happy story. And as we started out saying, today is Super Tuesday. The stakes are really high, but I don't think citizens feel very empowered and participatory in the process that it's about. So what do I mean when I talk about reversals in the history of advancing democracy? So first off, there is a history of advancing democracy in the United States. We shouldn't read, say, the 1619 Project or other reports of the continuing racism, the continuing inequality, the continued problems as suggesting there hasn't been any change, right? There has been change. There's been change in good directions it has been uneven, inadequate, and has often come in a 2 steps forward, 1 step backward with a left turn process, right? A jagged process of change. The US was founded, after all, as a republic with very limited democracy. When we say the US was founded as a democracy, that's at best a shorthand, right? The Constitution, right, rules out voting by most of the citizens of the United States, right? White men have to have a substantial amount of property of a kind that is taxed in a certain way, right, in order to vote. And some of the first social movements in the United States were rebellions by veterans of the Revolutionary War against having those who could vote in taxes on them rather than themselves. That is to say, merchants in the seaboard cities imposing taxes on small farmers inland in the west of New York State, all the way to Ohio, Shays' Rebellion, and so forth. So Americans had to work to extend democracy to white men who weren't well off, let alone African Americans who had been brought as slaves, or even if, in the small number of cases, they arrived free because they arrived from the Caribbean or from had already come after freedom, right? So the vote was denied to certainly current slaves and to most freed slaves. It was denied to women, it was denied to Native Americans who were not citizens, according to the Constitution, but were citizens of their different nations with whom the United States entered into treaty relations, which of course it repeatedly broke when it was convenient. And Americans have struggled to extend democracy to immigrants. We do not live in the first period of American history when there's been waves of anti-immigrant mobilization in the United States. So we had to work on all of these, and there was progress on all of these, right? Situation got better, but in each case was open. There was open opposition, right? None of these things just happened by a linear extension. Women only got the vote in 1920, right? After a very long period of mobilization, right? That was a significant struggle. The struggle, right, to improve conditions for American Indians, including to incorporate American Indians fully into American democracy, continues because it hasn't reached a level of full incorporation. Right? The struggle is currently renewed, including the opposition. So at every turn when relative chaos in American politics or other factors creates an opportunity, there is a resumption of opposition on class grounds, on gender grounds, on race grounds, on immigration grounds, to the full inclusion of other Americans, right? Now, at one level, this is shocking and upsetting. At another level, we shouldn't be so surprised because it takes a lot of working through to change deeply ingrained attitudes and habits. So one of the questions is when we pass a law that says we've changed the rules, these people are included, do we invest the time, the energy, the social work to change the conditions, right? The story of Reconstruction is a story of a not altogether well-organized attempt to do that nonetheless didn't get far enough before it was reversed, creating massive backlash and building new organizations that would be devoted to reversing the gains of Reconstruction. Right? Now, lots to be said about this. Read Du Bois' book on Reconstruction for a start. But right, the point I want to draw out is that was a big organized effort to try to transform the South fully effectively in this. In many cases, we haven't had a substantial effort to do that, and we've had backtracking. Let me give just a casual example. Right? So when women received the vote, the right to vote, right, there were many women's organizations, famously the League of Women Voters, but a variety of suffrage organizations, that were devoted to helping women exercise their right to vote effectively, right? And supporting them in this when there was pushback, when their husband said, well, the government may have said you could vote, but I didn't say you could vote, right? Building on this. Women were eligible already for participation in free public education, and in much of America, higher education. Right? There were, however, reversals. Right? So the rate of women's participation in higher education went up to 1945 and went down after World War II, for various reasons I'll come back to. Right? So these aren't battles that just get won once and for all easily. It takes a lot of effort to make a formal policy change take effect. Take the abolition of slavery, right? The abolition of slavery was a long struggle. It's basically an 18th, early 19th century struggle, one of the dominant social movements of the day, though there are lots of other social movements. White participation is driven largely by religious organizations in what's called the Second Great Awakening, a new evangelical era, when, among other things, American Protestants in particular, are saying it's a national sin that we tolerate slavery, and I don't want to be a part of that sin, and are campaigning, right? The famous John Brown, for example, among them. The medal that is struck, the coin in the upper left corner of your screen, right, containing the famous slogan, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Right, 1834 slogan, evoking two different modes of being connected. Right, I'm a fellow human being, but also the more religious and familial language, I'm your brother, right, was pivotal, right? There are lots and lots of versions of this. But it also raises another question that's sometimes passed over. Accounts of the abolition movement often make it sound like it's only a white movement to free Black people, and underestimate the extent to which there is a Black struggle for Black freedom as well. Famously back to Haiti in the Caribbean, but certainly in this country as well. And there's a long struggle. So the struggle leads to a civil war. When I say we've had degenerations of democracy, we've had it a lot. And it leads by high levels of incivility. It's not everybody was just having nice, polite debates until one day at Sumter there was an invasion. Right? One of the leading abolitionists, Senator Charles Sumner, was beaten to what became his death on the floor of the US Senate chamber by a member of Congress while the Senate was in session. Preston Scott Brooks of South Carolina took sufficient offense at Sumner's criticism of slaveholding as a sinful and shameful thing that he took a cane and beat Sumner over the head, causing him injuries from which he never recovered. Right? So, yes, the January attacks on Congress were extraordinary. But no, they weren't totally unprecedented. They were different and they were distinct. Right? One of the most famous moments in articulating the American democratic vision is the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, right, in which he articulates the importance of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Before the graves, marked by the crosses in the upper right-hand corner, that's a part of the Gettysburg Cemetery, right? But, right, 40 years later, the cross in the lower right-hand corner would be burning. A different interpretation of Christianity, a different stance on race, and more evidence of this issue of reversal of previous gains. And that goes on through the civil rights movement, on to George Floyd, and so forth. Or take the incorporation of immigrants. America has been a great success story, partly because it has done a pretty good job incorporating immigrants. But it has also done a pretty good job resisting the incorporation of immigrants at every turn. Keep out the Chinese. Keep out the Jews who are fleeing from Hitler. Keep out the Irish. That's the cartoon in the upper right corner, and on through to today. So yes, Statue of Liberty. Yes, welcome to the downtrodden of the earth, but no, not easy. All right. Now you say this may be populism, and this is a new thing. And populist resistance is also recurrent in democracy. But we should note that on the one hand, there are frustrated populists who are angry because they feel they're the real people and other people are horning in on their country, right? Donald Trump's favorite president, Andrew Jackson, is an interesting avatar of this. Jackson brought a major expansion in American democracy. It's with Jacksonian democracy that white men become able to vote without property restrictions, right? Jackson also brought a major expansion in the displacement of American Indians. He was not particularly bad on the slavery issue by the standards of his day, but he was terrible on Indians. Populism has often elevated demagogues, flawed great leaders who would stand up for the people, right? And the people, feeling disempowered, have felt the need of somebody to help them have power in the elite. But populism isn't the cause of these problems. It's a symptom, right? It's something that happens because we have those problems, and populism itself can be positive much of the time. The word comes from the US People's Party and the populist movement of the 1890s, which was largely a movement over financialism, hence the slogans like no cross of gold. That is, do not impose the gold standard in a way that will disadvantage farmers in their credit relations with all of this. So campaign for equal rights for all. It starts as a multiracial campaign until it's confronted with divide and conquer strategies in many ways. It's first and foremost a struggle to save family farming, but there is outreach to immigrant workers in cities. Not a full successful union, but outreach and an effort to overcome that boundary. So populism, right, can be basic to democracy. A struggle over who counts as the real people can be a positive struggle to include. It doesn't have to be a negative struggle to exclude, right? But things like that become negative when we face, the third of the three points I was going to make, a double movement. By this is just meant a massive change that necessarily brings a reaction. We have, among other things, combined democracy with capitalism, and a feature of capitalism is that it produces massive changes. This is what people like about capitalism and what they hate about capitalism, both. It goes both ways. New technologies, get your iPhones, right? Major advances, increases in wealth, but does it in ways that are also socially destabilizing, right? So that you get the Industrial Revolution, or more recently, globalization and deindustrialization, you get a turn to finance in forms that cause those intermediate associations to be undermined, disempower local communities, move populations around the country in basic ways, lose your faculty job in Northeast, or your factory job in Northeast Ohio, faculty too, really, but, and move to Houston because there's some oil money, right, or whatever, right? Now, the fact of change produces disorganization and disorganized responses, crime, enemy, and it produces organized responses on the right, like fascism, and on the left, like a democratic welfare state. The term double movement comes from a theorist named Karl Polanyi, who was, among other things, explaining the situation in the middle of the 20th century, and why at the same time, out of the same sources, you got fascism and you got social democratic campaigns for the welfare state. Because when you had so much upset, disempowering citizens, undermining their ability to organize their lives well, you got a reaction one way or the other. It could be crime, it could be fascism, it could be building a better state. What it would be was actually where politics came in. This is where citizens had choice, right? This is where what movement people participated in and built was crucial. The welfare state wasn't perfect, right? It didn't build a perfect society. It did improve a bunch of things. It improved college education, it improved home ownership. It often came with suburbanization of a kind that has since been criticized. Wasn't all good or all bad, but there was a lot of good in social mobility, in improved healthcare systems, in support for the retired, Social Security systems, in support for the unemployed. So it's worth remembering that there are a whole series of kinds of safety nets and social support systems that were built in the middle of the 20th century, 30s, 40s, 50s, early 60s, right? And systematically eroded since then. Like the death of unions, the death of lots of these social support systems, major programs to build public housing, right? For example, GI Bill to send people to college. Now, it wasn't all as pink as the pictures say, right? It was a lot of it driven by advertising and getting people to feel a need for more new refrigerators and more new Cadillacs than they really needed, but it wasn't all false, right? It's in this context that the civil rights movement flourished and Freedom Summer occurred, and flourished initially as a multiracial, cross-class, inter-regional movement that itself connected Americans. I said at the beginning, the military sometimes has connected Americans from different places. So did social movement activism. So did Freedom Summer. So did the whole civil rights movement. It connected college students from Ohio to struggling would-be voters in Alabama. Right? And that was an important task. What followed this era, and I have to wind up here, is an era of retrenchment from many of those gains. Not just because people became hard-hearted and managers were suddenly greedy. Managers are often greedy, owners are often greedy or something. The change was a change in the financial system and in the structures of the legal framework for business and in the very economy. So a combination of new technologies, changing businesses, rise of the service sector, but in very rapid order, in a space of 20 years, whole communities throughout what became to be called the Rust Belt of Ohio, of Pennsylvania, of Michigan, right, of West Virginia, lost their economic basis. And when they lost their economic basis, they lost their schools, they lost their hospitals, parents lost the chance that their children would come to work in the same community that they lived in, right? It's a massive displacement. So that's a bad thing. But the really bad thing is we did almost nothing to repair the damage or replace the institutions. We did almost nothing for retraining. We did almost nothing to help workers make a new life in a new place when they had to move. We did almost nothing, in fact, really almost less than nothing, to help those communities rebuild, keep medical care in the local community, keep a school rather than having it close. Rather, we said efficiency dictates that we not tax the rich to provide those services, that we encourage people to pick up sticks and move in all these ways. So we failed to carry out a kind of obligation, not just to somebody else, to ourselves as a whole country, trying to be an integrated country under these contexts. And the result was insecurity and division. And so I am going to stop here with this note, right? We get the homeless crisis we have today. We get the problems of the affordability of housing that we face today, right? The tension in that graph between the price of housing and the income of families, right? We get inequality, we get various kinds of inequality, we get an asset bubble, and we get debt on an unprecedented scale out of this set of social changes and our political decision not to do very much to manage it. It's not just that technology or markets changed. It's that we collectively made political decisions not to help people have better lives through that. And time has made a decision that I'm not going to tell you how to help have a better life now. There will be no continuation into the present unless you ask good questions. Thank you.
Questions, if you just want to stand up and project, that I think will work.
Could you say something about the last slide? So the relationship between
kinds of debt.
You're talking about personal debt and then national debt. So we're
not in this. This is all some version of personal debt. So if you had national debt in this, say the government's debt, that would be a very big. That would be a huge bar in that. I think it's about 45% of the total. So government debt, federal government debt, equals about 45% of the total of personal debt, but it's a separate batch of debt. And then you've also got other kinds of public debt to consider. So you've got bonds that have been issued for school authorities that don't count as federal government debt, but they are debt nonetheless, and so forth. So there's a whole question about debt incurred by the state at various levels, from local to national. And special organizations. This is all versions of personal debt, right? So the green in this is auto loans, which are a surprisingly big part of debt. It's a reason, as I mentioned to students in a class earlier today, why General Motors makes more money from its credit division than it makes from selling cars. Right? That debt is big business. There's a spread of debt. A change in American society and that's facilitated by a change in laws is that you don't have to be a bank to be in a lot of businesses for mortgages or other kinds of debt. So there are a variety of what are called shadow banks of other organizations like General Motors, which is not a bank but finances cars, right? And all that. So there's car loans. There's credit card debt, which is significant. There's a variety of other, which means things like you bought something on a time payment. You bought new furniture for your house on a time payment from the store or something. And there's student loan debt. The biggest increase is student loan debt, right? It's, as it happens, also the biggest part by the end of the chart. That is, it's slightly larger than auto loan debt. But the point of the chart is how much it's increasing. So this is just from for the last 20 years or so. If you went back further, you would find student debt fading into obscurity. Student debt started being a real thing in the 1960s, but a tiny thing, when colleges would begin to give people combinations of scholarship and loan packages. And the loan part grew over time, but also college tuition grew dramatically over time, so that if you were getting loans, they were bigger and bigger loans. And then this was added by a transformation in higher education in which there were more and more for-profit private institutions where people could get loans to go to study to be a car mechanic or a welder or whatever, and take on student loans. So you get this burgeoning amount of student loan, which is why it's a big political issue now, as well as a big personal issue for a lot of people trying to start their lives. At the moment when people are confronting high costs of housing, they are also confronting high costs of loan repayment. And the point of the chart is that it wasn't always that way, that you could have college without making people go into debt. Right? It's a choice. Again, it's a political policy choice about what to do. Now, there are other factors in it. I'll say one of them to note, that it's not like government stopped spending money. So you might think, this is fiscal conservatism. The governments don't want to raise taxes. No, taxes went up during almost all of this period. The thing that most closely tracks is the cost of imprisonment. So, and I can't resist telling you, so, right, the US incarceration rate during the same period, right? So you may or may not think it's a good idea to put people in prison, especially during the war on drugs, when many of the prison sentences were relatively small drug offenses. But whatever you think of the justice of the imprisonment, one of the effects was to cost a lot of money. And so there is a good study of the state of California, which shows that there is a very direct correlation between the increased cost of prisons and stopped blockages on funding for education at all levels, including schools, pre-university schools. Yeah, sure.
I have a question.
What, if anything, gives you hope that this political moment may result in an expansion of democracy?
I see more organizing, not enough more, but this is it. So if I were to say the one thing that most gives me hope is more people trying to organize to do things. Scattered all over the place, a million different issues, a million different organizations, people working on unions, people working on climate change, people working on environmental cleanups, people working on a bunch of different issues. But organizing, it seems to me, is the pivotal thing. It gives me hope, and that's what's going up. Now, at the time we wrote this book, we only published it 18 months ago, so this is not ancient history. I was more optimistic, and I think all three of us were. So we thought that there would be more of a coalescence of that organizing into a real movement to produce major change than there has been. And it has to be said, the organizing is not all of what causes I would be sympathetic with. A lot of the organizers on the far right, and it's organizing for bigger and better walls between the US and Mexico or something like that. But it is organizing, right? And so I see hope in that. I could go to a list of the specific movements and causes, but I don't see the hope in policy terms. That is, I see our policymakers as stuck and unable to make policy. I'm very worried about that domestically. There are a lot of issues we don't do well with. I'm even more worried internationally. We face huge risks in the world and challenges, and we are sort of unable to pass bills. So whether you are for or against aid to Israel, aid to Gaza, aid to Ukraine, confrontations with China, higher tariffs, all of these things, they are big issues, and we are not able to make coherent policy. We are kind of at political loggerheads with each other. And so there are things that's what worries me most, that we will actually fail to deal with climate change, fail to deal with war, because we simply can't get past short-term partisan political confrontations. And the path out of that, the reason I say organizing, is that that's where I think people begin to work together with a tangible objective. We really want to accomplish something here. We're not just raising our different flags and trying to win. We are trying to clean up a toxic waste dump that is hurting the lives of the kids in our community or whatever. Yeah. You.
Thank you for the lecture. I wanted to ask you a couple things, because I guess what I'm seeing from your presentation is that talking about this interdependence, I think would be the right word, not only in the individual sense, but then also economic interdependence. So I was wondering what makes you say, because what I'm seeing is that has been like an ongoing trend in politics. And so could you make the conclusion that internationally we're like becoming more interdependent and intertwined? And also, what is the US stake in that?
Yeah.
On the other hand, like there was some statistic that like last year, for example, 96% of bills were bipartisan and they actually received bipartisan support. So it's not that we don't agree on that much. It's not that we can't pass bills. Is it in the crafting of the policy, or what is it that makes it the way that it is?
No,
on
great.
the other hand, for example, France right now, they just like constitutionally protected abortion and stuff. So I'm wondering, like, is this like U.S. only sort of the generation of democracy and this, or is it U.S. against the world? Because it sort of depends on the international system at this point.
Absolutely.
With predators from China and so on.
So that's a series of great questions, and they are really key questions. First, I think this is the pattern, which has its specific US characteristics, is more or less general to the rich so-called democracies. I mean, countries aren't just either a democracy or not a democracy, they're kind of more or less. But in any case, to the European countries, to Australia and Canada and so forth. So I think democracies are having a lot of this problem in general. And it's because of economic and other underlying changes. So in France as well, there are huge protests of rural French people complaining about the treatment by a state that is dominated by urban interests. And so that's produced massive protests, and it produces votes for the far right and lots of other issues. Brexit, the change in British policy was on similar lines. The AfD support is in similar lines in Germany, although with the added twist of the former communist as well as the post-Germany, right? So it's a pattern I think is pretty widespread, and it too is interconnected, right? So the nationalist right is connected internationally. It's not like nationalists don't talk to other nationalists. They only talk to the people in their own nation. They talk to the people on their side, and it's coordinated in Europe. And there's international fundraising. So one thing is the pattern is I think wider, though of course there are national variations in every case. Two, you're absolutely right about interconnections. So things are interconnected in the US economically, financially. They're interconnected internationally, economically, financially, and indeed by migration flows and cultural flows. But there are efforts to try to restrict and block migration flows. And there's a refugee crisis. So it's not like there's just a Smith saying, right, we will all be better connected if we have more movement of people. There's a lot of resistance. And the pattern here is, I think, it's not that everybody welcomes connections. The US and the world were more and more interconnected globally right up until the beginning of World War I. Right? So it began at a high point. The previous high point of globalization in finance and trade was the moment of World War. So it was the way we dealt with the globalization and how we positioned ourselves in it and how we tried to take advantage of it and how we misinterpreted other countries' strategies and all of that. That was crucial. And so I think that's the issue now. It's we have a high degree of financial and market globalization, right, that is not matched by a level of commitment to negotiated political cooperation globally.
I do want to interrupt. I think there's an event.
And we should get out of the way.
We should wrap
See,
up.
this is the way history goes, you know?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you to Craig. Thank you also for joining the Western Center. And I want to thank the Western Center staff and faculty for supporting and organizing the